Hello everyone, today we talk about the European reaction in front of the Black Death of the 14th century, which is dramatically familiar to us in these times. We are somewhat luckier, right? Even if it sounds bad in the face of so much sufferance and especially all the systemic shortages that we'll have to face pretty soon, but not just from an economical point of view, or at least with direct consequences of it on the political and social level, right? And that's something that we still haven't fully acknowledged about this. That aside from the tragedy of the death and of people losing jobs, this event will sensibly reshape our political and social reality, right? In a way that is, in fact, unpredictable, right? We didn't predict properly even this, like in the sense we knew we would face at some point in the 21st century very likely this kind of pandemics. We had actually predicted everything, where it would have stemmed from, what characteristics it would have had. All the virological projections actually match with how this virus and how it was known before in its familiar types, let's call it in this way, would act, right? So we are lacking this day to even notice things, as we realize in the 14th century. By comparison, people didn't even know modern science. They lived in a world of of ignorance, of course, at many levels, that made them confront with improper, insufficient, even damaging means and solutions to the problem, right? So this is maybe a very interesting period in time to rediscover. Not much because of the plague in itself, right? I noticed that in popular culture, when we talk about the Black Death of 1347, 48, and following years, we tend to, there is a sort of creepy and attraction towards the morbid aspects of it, and the fact, oh my god, the plague, look at the Middle Ages, it was so rough, so wild, and all this, even, in fact, macabre aspects of the stories that legitimately, impress us. But what we should, and we have already talked about the plague in this sense, in other videos, but I think it's interesting to focus especially now, because of the comparison with reality, with current reality, is how this event shaped the history of Europe, right, from those political and social perspective we were talking about before, because that naturally we should also be intelligent enough not to draw parallelisms that are somewhat anachronistic and mismatching with reality. We are in a very different condition. Paradoxically, even the effects of this pandemics will not be probably so impacting at the root of our systems, like the Black Death in proportion did at the time. But the sheer absolute quantity, let's say, of changes that will occur today will be definitely greater than at the time, right? So it's two different levels in how this will change. But we have to acknowledge that from the mid-14th century, that was, by the way, a moment in which Europe and the rest of Eurasia actually had already gone under a deep moment of crisis, right? Of stagnation in part, and if not a regression, right, of recession, openly in many contexts. This thing wasn't coming, in fact, as an isolated phenomenon. Many people today studying this, this topic argue legitimately that the plague might have actually not been the major cause of the crisis, right? First of all, it came relatively late. This was a crisis that started in the last decades of the 13th century. It had also its more dramatic effects, especially in the first decades of the 14th. We're talking about major problems, financial collapses, environmental changes that impacted, as we will see now, floods, poor harvests, seemingly a cooling of the climate. So many people wonder whether this change actually, this plague didn't actually occur just because it found fertile ground, right? That in different conditions, especially among the lower strata of the population, immunitary defenses of which had decreased sensibly by this time. So even in here, something that has to do with our times as well, as in the previous, in the last 20 years, if not more, things have not gone particularly well, in case you noticed. I mean, there was a dramatic improvement, of course, in the last 20 years, especially for the poorest countries in the world. We made enormous, and I stress enormous and radical improvements in terms of basilar things like, reducing child mortality, spreading, health assistance, and increasing literacy. I mean, poverty rates have dramatically collapsed, fortunately. And this is being a great achievement that naturally doesn't impress us if we remain closed within our, narrow minds, and we pretend that enormous social issues to get, higher wages in a condition where you can't afford easily to eat, to get an education, and even a job, even as underpaid in certain relative circumstances it is. But just remember that there are people out there that can't even have drinkable water and have to drink it anyway, or that, and this is really happening, but still in a measure that is incomparable. So people will have to complain all the time, this world is so evil, so disgusting, everything is going so well. I mean, look at the history of humanity in the last 100 years, and then please have shame for yourself, because this is an insult to the dignity of the, I would say, minimal human intelligence. I mean, here we're talking about levels of ignorance that then you wonder why crises also happen, right? It's not just a matter of why they get prepared, right? Because if a society has this inertia of people that essentially just look at short-term goal and just whine and complain and essentially just need to fill gaps without systematizing the structure where this whole thing is framed, you have no moral orientation, and this doesn't naturally make things easier when the true crisis actually strikes, where lots of problems eventually will become, make the ones you were complaining about, making yourself ashamed without me telling you to. And this is also something that was actually present at the time, because even the 13th century had been this moment of great growth, of unprecedented wealth that was being spread actually at middle classes level in ways that hadn't basically happened before. In a way that also increased monetary economy, and that at one point it cracked, right? And the reason why it did so, it's not just, cooling of the climate. You can't explain everything about climate change. Actually, it was not even decisive problem. Even the complexity of social structures, and you throw in this, single factor that solves the equation, right? It may well be, of course, that climate played its own massive part in this. It's perfectly plausible, especially when you compare this period with others in history. If you look at the agricultural cycles related to there was definitely a component to by this. But if you look more in depth into those medieval societies, you realize that this great expansion of the 13th century was savage, uncontrolled, unprecedented in terms of rate of growth, right? And that's something that resembles pretty closely what, in a nutshell, the history of the 20th century has been, right? We have earned, of course, our wealth. We have worked for it, our previous generations especially. Maybe, just there is a debate on this because, of course, some say, you were in a favorable moment booming after World War II because of certain particular circumstances. Yeah, it is true, and we will have to get even in contemporary history. But we can't objectively say that, of course, we didn't deserve the wealth we built in the 20th century. But we have to admit that there are lots of things that have gone wrong under that point of view. And they have gone wrong chiefly for lack of political and institutional culture, right, of civic values, rather than, just producing is not by itself a value, right? It's a value for what is exploitable in potential, right? Look at, I don't know, the United States and the Soviet Union, right? It was a race for armaments, but, U.S. citizens lived, pretty well, while Soviets lived pretty damn bad in comparison. And yes, it is not an opinion. And why? Because simply there was something rotten at the root, right? And guess when the Soviet Union ended up like, and asked people who lived in that system or just even in the Eastern Bloc, and look at them, their economies now, or what you can spot in those systems that failed pretty badly, and you will realize the absolute value of this lack of democratic discipline, because at the end of the day, that's true. But also definitely in the Western Bloc, in the democratic world, not everything is going well, right? And not everything has gone well, not just because of lack of democratic education, etc., but because once again there is who has considered profit as the only possible way of, without needing to know anything else but, let's say, economics, right? Taking away history, culture, all the other factors. That's recipe for disaster. Say, I become a skilled economist, right? And it seems kind of ironically that, among economists, actually, wages are not that good, that actually we're not even among other, allegedly successful professions. I was reading that in the United States, on average, there are more millionaires among school teachers than among lawyers, right? Just for saying one. If you don't know, in fact, about politics, about society, about history, right? Why is important to know history in general? The most economically oriented mind would say, no, it's useless. It's just learning things that we can't profit with. Are you kidding me? Right? That's probably one of the soundest investments in general. This is not a matter of salary policies or something. It's just a matter of how rich a society can get by acknowledging how societies work. And studying this from history is the best, right, if not the only way to understand it. And we can really form a civic education and a moral responsibility and a true intelligence on the base of this. This is not a criticism towards people who are economically oriented. I was choosing that path at some point in my life as well, and I still don't see anything wrong in it. But I do recognize that if you make this sectorial at the point that you'd say, well, I just learn how to try to exploit the situation economically, and then you don't look around yourself, things are going to go pretty badly, right? For example, I consider myself an individualist in many ways, but individualism, like all isms, has its deterior aspects as well. And if you think that just thinking about yourself is a viable way of, it actually is a misinterpretation, because you can take care of yourself educating yourself, right? That's still individualism, and that's still somewhat fine if it remains within healthy boundaries. But the idea is I measure myself just by the sheer amount of what I can get at the moment, right? It's not really a healthy way of doing things. Also because civilizations, in this sense, have proven repeatedly to fail when they developed their fundamentals of growth, right, of expectations, etc., simply on the base of let's exploit what happens on the short term. This is naturally imposed in part by the reality of the world as it is, right? Even in talking about military culture, things that happen around the world are unpredictable largely, but up to a few months at the regional scale, right? Unless something, and even in there is something more likely, less likely. The current pandemics is something that was kept out sometimes of the projections because it said, oh yeah, well, let's try to, like with this artificial intelligence that is able now theoretically to sort out the market, or at least to make less mistakes than economical analysts do, says, okay, well, this works unless something big happens, like a major pandemics or, Third World War, where, yeah, fortunately, well, among the two, the best, the first option is definitely the best one. But aside from the fact that we would perfectly do well without, it's also something that, in this sense, has caught us unprepared. And why? We knew it would happen, right? And the structures, the systems that were to cope with this were dramatically underfunded. And why? At this point, this is not just a matter of, it's not even, about running after success and, always being on the edge of competition. That's plain stupidity in some form, right? You know that thing can happen, but yes, you say, well, let's hope it doesn't happen. It's not really a good way of coping with the situation. This is true that, humans can't cope with everything, can't foresee everything. We can't really ensure our system as if we could be at all time prepared. But definitely there is a healthier way, being more prudent, being more considerate, and this thing happens largely from looking at how history goes, because once again, that's the real field that you can analyze, right? That history never repeats itself, not even once, right? You must be seriously mental to think it does. The point is, though, that there are similar patterns that represent themselves every once in a while that you can spot at least analogies with the current ones, and that can help you to look essentially at the complexity and also at the unpredictability, right, for which you should be prepared. The reason why I'm telling this is that if you look at even the videos I made 1 year ago about these topics, I was telling you not really that pandemics would occur, right? Because even though it's something I've always been thinking of, but that our system was undergoing a crisis that we had entered in already, and that we had neither realized of being in, at least for the potential consequences that this could have, right? We all know we have been living in a crisis since a long time now, even before 9/11. But it's about the dramatic nature of the consequences in here that we haven't began to build the antibodies to cope with the consequences, and that's what makes me seriously uncomfortable, and that's why I also began to talk about history on YouTube, because I feel like that there is an optimism even surrounding the certain attitudes of interpreting history, framing history, of using, if not instrumentalizing history, that make me think that as a society, as a civilization, we haven't quite understood what's the use we should do of history, right? And nor did people at the time knew, because in the 14th century, it was a wild system spreading, right? And it was full of faults, of misfunctions, right? There was a dramatic level of instability, after all, even in those moments that preceded the crisis in itself. Epidemics had increased, which is something that happened also at this point, right? We had three since the 2000s, and the three major ones. I mean, it could evolve into pandemic. We had an increase of there was at the time an increase of wars, for example, and even of conflicts, right? With the only difference that at the time they didn't have nuclear weapons that froze most of warfare, right? So, and at this time we do, but even so, once again, from the early 2000s, wars worldwide have increased, right? After all, the moment of Cold War, not even, but wars like, I don't know, the Vietnam War, etc. From World War II, we had managed, freezing in part the intensity of warfare, especially in terms of relative lethality of the wars themselves, right? Or better, the amount of people who died over the rest of the population in the world. At this time, the level has just slightly increased, because still the deterrent effect of nuclear weapons is such for which we don't want to fight wars, and that's pretty reasonable, and that's what we created nuclear weapons for, partly. But it's at the time this didn't exist, so there was no central state, there was no single source of law, there was no major central power that could, right? So you can imagine here a system was evolving essentially by itself, and in paradoxically developing a actually a very good base, chiefly because if you really lack stability, if you lack a direction and a structure, well, what you will be working for at this point will be oriented in that direction. And it worked, because you would think that from the crisis of the 14th century, medieval civilization would collapse like it happened to with Justinian pandemics, seemingly, with late antiquity. Well, it didn't happen. Medieval civilization had the strength, and we made lots of videos about this, about the resilience of medieval civilization, to structure itself further, to have a more crystallized society. Definitely the Ancien Regime begins, we can't say at this time, but we had the cradle of the modern state, the Renaissance, humanism, is moving exactly at this point. So you can find actually in the darkest hour of the crisis something better emerging, right? The problem we have today, in my opinion, is we have grown over-reliant instead of, the idea that there is a state that will always, help us, that we will always be maintained by or served by or protected by. This is not really the case, right? This is not, fortunately, such a catastrophic moment either, as it seems, but just you may call me pessimistic. I think I'm pretty objective about it. We will suffer of this we will pay for this mistake, right? We will test this in the next months, in the next years, and we will pay this. Our generation and even our children probably will pay for this, right? It will be a long-term process, and it will be, however, much tougher, right, than we can imagine. And this will be accompanied not just by, one day we will magically come back to rise, right? We will compensate surely at some point, right? What is being, the gap is being left now by these measures that have been partially necessary to cope with this situation. But there is no reason to think that what will happen next will be such a fast rise, right? And but we can hope at least we'll be more stable. Well, this is also what happened after the mid 14th century, right? There was a Europe that took a lot of time before reaching the pre-Black Death, for example, demographic levels, right? Even the financiary dynamism and many other. There was definitely even territorialization of this system. Like the 13th century had seen the apex of universalism in many ways. Also, the Mongols had opened the Asian routes. Europeans went to China. They settled there. They began to teach things. They went back and forth. After that, there was a more sharply defined territorialization of power. That's also a very important character. I don't know how it will work now, because actually since the creation of the nation state in the end of the from the end of the 18th to the beginning of the 19th century, we have still been living in this formula, right? And in the last decades, even a certain philosophy I don't completely agree with, I don't agree with actually much at all, is saying, now everything is fluidifying, right? Everything is kind of, the nation state is the states as such also are crumbling. There is going to be more chaos, more confusion. In part, it is true because we have developed means and relations that somewhat have become more capable of dealing with the boundaries posed by the nation state as such. Lots of things have changed culturally as well, but aside from the fact that this has always happened, right, that what happens on today's battlefields or in today's politics is something that has always existed historically. It's nothing new. I do realize there are, morally bankrupt, and probably also economically bankrupt people who have to sell cheap books about alleged strategic culture according to them, which they don't even know what it means, for which they have to invent all new paradigms, new ideas. They have to stress the idea of revolution and fireworks and things that change radically, like, because people get impressed by this, especially who does not have a specific competence, gets easily sucked in these delusions. But it's nothing new, right? And the increase of also of emotional, of emotivity, let's say, during the time of crisis is another thing that we can easily see in the 14th century as well, but that didn't stop the people who were determined to build actually something much more, stable and consistent and centralized, also taking away from others individual freedom, because this is also what happened. Like, the crisis of the 14th century hit chiefly the urban centers, these areas where there was a greater academic concentration, where certain dynamics had brought in even lots of poor, underpaid, poorly fed masses, etc. But on the long run, that was the center of power. It remained it. The countryside was progressively swallowed by these major centers. Regional states began to emerge. Right, we have seen this thing of many videos. And the ancien regime began, right? In the 13th century, as a peasant, you were much better off than you would be in the 15th, notoriously, right? The 14th century actually was specifically the moment in which the peasants lost their place in politics and in institutions. We could have had a fourth state in the parliaments of the time with the peasantry, right? It didn't happen. And this didn't happen because of the limits of the peasantry in itself, right? It's not that they lacked strength or lacked force, but they simply lacked vision, they lacked awareness, they lacked a constitutive tissue, if you want. And this seems to be very, very close to still the overwhelming amount of, the masses of this, still at this time. At the time, most people were peasants by an overwhelming majority. And still today, lots of people are, this average thing we have become in some ways. But I think that at the time like today, the elites will take over again. And I don't even think it's necessarily bad. I mean, in certain relative terms it is, but if the alternative is chaos, right, even triggered by the same masses, because those three, look at the Jacquerie and what happened, right? Those might have been exploited and starving to death. But what they wanted to achieve was, frankly, no better than what their masters actually wanted, right? So let's dispel these classist prejudices for which, there is a class of poor, exploited martyrs that, in all revolutions, the most radically violent, undemocratic, ferocious, and cruel, and I don't even know how to define this. We're effectively the masses, right? The revolutions have always been triggered by the middle classes that are actually the most, dynamic, the most intelligent, the ones that know what is need to be done, right? Another characteristics of these times is the erosion of the middle class, right? that a healthy society must have a sound middle class, right? Not a low stratum of alleged equality that, fortunately, by definition, can never exist in humanity. Thank God for this. But not even an elite where too many people own almost everything and all the rest is a flat mass of slaves in some ways. Of course, we are very far today from being there, but still the tendency in the last decades has been so, right? We have stopped to grow consistently. The same thing happened in the 13th century, right? And in the late 13th century, it's as if the boomers had been those guys born in the early 13th century at the time, right? In 14th, you start seeing the end of the 13th, beginning of 14th, you start seeing this thing slowing down in the same exact problems. That is a system that was used to produce, to obtain, to achieve, that at one point began to see the soil lacking under their feet, right, and crumbled. I ended up actually making parallelisms and stressing differences because naturally there were lots of differences with those days' times, but the analogies that exist are pretty striking and are pretty fascinating, and that's something I would be the happiest person in the world if what I'm thinking since some year wasn't true, right? But sadly, day after day, this thing gets confirmed, and just it strikes me how this is the case of a moment in history, by the way, in which this one of the end of the 13th and the early 14th century, which I'm specializing, right, specifically, and that have seen with a certain degree of care by some standard by now, even though I'm not a sociologist, I don't study history of society, as you know, and this was, for example, a very different world in terms of how war, as we were saying before, was fought, right? Today we are not really paying this great cost for war after all. I mean, there are certain regions in the world that are ravaged since generations now by warfare, this causing major problems, terrorism, immigration, and for whichever the reasons are. I'm actually not sympathetic at all for those who have pietistic views towards these realities, but I do realize that the sufferings and the disruption and the drama of this all, right? And but that's not as nearly as close as the role that warfare had in this specific time, especially the beginning of 14th century, first half of the 14th century was probably one of the most tense times of warfare in the whole European history, in proportion to the times, right? But another aspect that I think it's important to stress and that I dedicate today's video to is the spiritual, the ideal, if you want, the moral side of the story. Because it is true that we live in a world in which structures are important, but ideas are important as well. And especially in our own world, I think that ideas can make a much greater difference than in that world, right? Simply because we are, on average, more powerful. That is, we own more wealth, more wealthy in absolute terms, and by far, by an enormous far, right? Not just to a 14th century, average 14th century European, but even to an average 1900 European, right? So once again, we live in a disgustingly opulent world, and even if wealth is not adequately distributed in this regard, it's mostly wasted rather than else, and even in here the reasons are not just the evil guys at the top, right? Because there are always going to be evil guys at the top. The problem is that there are evil guys in the center, evil guys at the bottom, right? And that's the main problem with our societies, that, once again, if we were educated enough to understand what the situation requires, maybe we would do a better job, right? Not knowing about just, technicalities, but knowing about society as a whole, which is what history teaches you, right? Um, and we can change the course of the world and kill potentially much more people, because politics kills people, right? And this is another thing we deal with often with von Clausewitz. We have developed an hysterical society that freaks out when we kill, an innocent, rightly so, maybe by some standard, bombarding strike, surgical strike. But we don't give a damn if we kill thousands of people just for a market policy that are innocent as well. People that are innocent as well, right? And sometimes it's even just as direct as that. Like, why do we keep selling cigarettes, right? And how much does this cost to us? Nobody cares, but everybody freaks out if they are from one political side that has to stress that everybody who uses violence for political purposes which is always by definition by political purpose in some way, and doesn't want it, right? We are creating a society of civic illiterates. We have no idea what the hell is happening now. We are regressing. Our societies are displaying in front of this crisis the typical attitudes of refusal, of denial, of hysteria, of in other words, this dominion of emotivity. That is what we spotted at the time, right, from the sources in the 14th century. So mentality and sensitivity in front of the crisis, this is a big deal, right? And we will be studying it in the next generations like crazy, right? At the time, in the mid-14th century, the plague made this enormous impression among the contemporaries, right? This is somewhat, debatable in the sense that if you read the sources of the time, you realize that in a way or another, they were polarized by this thing. Everybody noticed it. Everybody felt the need to talk about it, to stress the horrors of it, the damages. But there is also another character that is beautiful to me and that I don't recognize in our own society, that is having the concrete, pragmatic mindset to say, okay, but now we go on. Part of this is due to the fact that, they didn't see this event as literally the end of the world. Some did, as we will see now. Naturally, there was a religious mindset that at the time stressed, from one side, this eschatological, apocalyptic views, but that in many ways was the emotional side of it. But then there was a most pragmatic and realistic one, that is that the same religion gives, that is, okay, we know we have to die. We actually would like the come of Christ, right? We're scared because we know that before that, like hellish things will have to happen on earth, and these seem to be likely, but we will all have to die. And this view of that a true Christian should be concerned, shouldn't be impressed by the earthly events, things that shall pass anyway, right? Gives a lot of confidence after all. And what I've spotted, I don't know whether, in this period, there is also a great deal of secularization of mindset. If you look at mid-14th century people, especially in certain areas of Europe that were, by the way, the most advanced, and by certain standards now, you would think the cradles of Catholicism, you'd say that these were more emotionally dominant. Absolutely not. These people were actually the most pragmatic. They were ones that were about to develop the Renaissance. There is, frankly, a cynical and tendentially rationalistic take on reality, right? And you read them passing through these events and saying, okay, yes, this is bad, but this is not the end of the world. Things go on. The chronicle continues. Events, politics. The thing doesn't stop here, right? So there is this great sense of we'll get through it. There is not even the attempt to say, okay, we will go now in darker times. You don't get it. Today we get it. I actually think it is true as well. Like for the aforementioned reasons, I think we will not become better because of this. I mean, individually. Maybe the system will get better, but I think individually we will have problems to cope with this. And partly this is due to the same psychological attitude to reality. I would say something banal, almost probably insignificant, but even knowing about what happened in the 14th century is a way of saying, is a way of probably, getting yourself used to the idea that these things happened, that these were people just like us, that our ancestors were there, and that we are here because they went through that. And those people showed more discipline given their worldview and beliefs and level of knowledge and awareness, right, than we do today with our own means, right? Fortunately, today we don't go exterminating Jews because, of coronavirus, right? These people, unfortunately, as we will see now, pogroms flared at this point, but, there was someone gassing 6 million Jews just a couple of generations ago. So we're not that, distant from the atrocity of a decision, actually, of an actually lucid decision, because that was not the one mind that decided for millions. That there was entire peoples and entire cultures that believed that was more or less fine to do that. So and don't even think for a moment that such traits can be erased by things like, I don't know, democracy arrived, hence we don't have any problem anymore. These things are potentially behind the corner, not in the same way, because fortunately, at least, in the same, as we've seen, history never repeats itself in the same way, but there are ways to cause those deaths, right? And don't think that the management of this situation during coronavirus is being crystalline clear, right? If it was even for just one person, right, there are lots of things that we'll have to explain at some point, because I don't want to be polemical, but I truly believe that here there was a dramatic lack of even scientific education in coping with what happened, especially at the political level, because we knew this would happen. Again, if you had studied what, Osterholm wrote, for example, you would have been a bit more prepared. But it's not even that. It's the getting you the habit of that things can change slowly, we don't need to hurry. No, there are moments in which you need to hurry. And you didn't do it, and hundreds of thousands of people died. Right? And let's not forget what just happened. Now we're thinking like, oh yes, we are all together in the world solving this problem now. Do we want to realize that this thing started for very specific political responsibilities of a dictatorial regime? Right, we're still speaking of communist countries in 2020. I mean, this is a great problem, and is it addressed enough? Are we realizing that there is something seriously wrong with people that can't cause the death of hundreds of thousands of others just because of their political and moral and cultural bankruptcy? Because to rule a communist dictatorship, you are culturally inferior, and there is no other way to put it, right? Because that's a deliberate choice to do something extremely criminal and stupid and nonsensical, and getting away with that, right? So the free world should stop even the attempt of commending certain behaviors. And we're not talking just about China specifically, but look at many other countries in the world, how they have been handling this thing. And you are thankful to be born, at least in a democratic country, where, yeah, you may not stop the epidemic from spreading by being deported, which might have been better in some way, right, if there were too many other people to die. But you still at least know what the hell is going on in the first place. You're not going to cause major global damage just because you are a morally bankrupt state, right? That's a shame, and we should condemn this by far. And it doesn't seem people are very concerned about this. We're just talking about masks, right? And not even talking decently about economy, because this thing, again, will have a major impact. Nobody seems to force it, because up to now it's been fine, right? So until I don't lack money, I don't believe it, right? This is the power of habit, the power of mentality, and that's why we should wake up a little bit more. Think in 14th century, naturally, a situation in which that strikes in with this rapidity, right? Because Black Death spread pretty quickly. There was lack of remedies, ignorance on the causes and on the ways of the contagion itself. And there are striking analogies with today's reality, right? For example, there was a very empirical approach to the problem, right? At the time was empirical at the very level of realizing what it was about. They didn't know about, of course, viruses. So they adopted, however, measures that are essentially the same ones we're adopting now, socially speaking, to stem the spread, right? Gatherings were forbidden, the travels were limited, the sickly were segregated, right? Well, in some cases, of course, also sheltered and helped, but sometimes really not, right? In the cities were instituted apposite magistracies in order to isolate the individuals and the headquarters, right? This is something, for example, like, it's not that it was particularly effective, but there was a response of this type. Today, we didn't act so, I don't know, I can say whether at the time they act quickly, obviously not, but for considering their knowledge of the thing, they realized what needed to be done even in this way. In our world, as we were saying before, we acted pretty damn slow. I mean, we let this thing in, knowing perfectly what it would have been like. Which is paradoxical. Just why? For, saving some money before, fantastic. Now see how much you have to pay for it. Not just in human life, but in actual money that you liked so much, right? Then since from the 15th century, in certain peripheral areas or outside the walls were created also some lazarets where the infected were confined, right? The contaminated were confined. And at the gates of the cities were enacted more rigid controls, right? It was imposed also the quarantine to the ships coming from the Asian ports. And that's where also famously the term comes from, 40 days of waiting on board. And during the epidemics, the political and economical life was paralyzed, right? The councils were not summoned for fear of the contagion. Also, the merchants and the goods didn't travel. This is a problem we have been having also now, right? Largely in at least in terms of small businesses, as you realize. And just think about the economical impact even at the time. We usually don't talk about this, but there was a massive reshaping of the investments, right? This financial sector collapsed, especially. There was a marked coming back on land assets. And this, by the way, increased in turn the territorialization of power. And this is something could happen even today. With at least, and not much in a spatial sense, but rather on the increase of government powers, right, on the citizens. This has already happened. Look at what happened in China, or in Russia in the meanwhile, or even in Hungary. I mean, this is normal by a certain standard, because in moments like this, that a certain amount of nationalization is necessary. That an effective response can go in parallel with a fragmented one, where everybody decides what to do, right? And that's where part of naturally of individual freedom is lost. But once again, there is a social responsibility at the same time, and our societies are built on the base of hierarchies, and exactly for that reason. Not because I don't like individual freedom, it's just because I realize that if, in case of emergency, I can't, there are more chances for me personally to get better if, there is a concerted effort, and at that point you need a leader, you need someone who gets things done, right? And this conjuncture definitely had spread terror, legitimately. People couldn't explain the causes of the subsequence, for example, the poor harvests, of the epidemics as such, and the wars and other natural events, for example, as the flood that hit Florence in 1333, or the earthquake that in 1348, the same year of the plague, shook the Austrian Alps, causing 10,000 deaths, right? So this was definitely, think about the Great Famine of 1315-17. I mean, people died in the thousands, and many thousands, and this was, as we were saying before, all a major conjuncture, right? Lots of factors were happening at the same time, probably connected, right? Definitely earthquakes were connected to anything, but I mean the fact that they brought death, poverty, misery. This maybe impoverished people at the point they couldn't eat as well as they could, so their immunity system was weaker, and the plague hit harder there, right? So yeah, it is connected in that sense. And was naturally a spontaneous reaction in that sense that today I don't see much. That is also interesting. As I was saying before, there is a sense of incumbent, of a darker reality that is definitely coming, but we're still unaware of what what form this will take. At the time, they tended to interpret it as an apocalyptic announcement, right? In this events was seen the action of the force of evil that signaled the approximation of the end of the world, right? And were spread also penitence practices with devotional brotherhoods that, counting on the salvation through the atonements of sins, practice flagellation and also toured around on pilgrimage, which definitely didn't help much, together with processions, actually to stem the contagion, right? People went out participating to these events and to be saved from the plague, and instead they got infected in the process, like in these large crowds. And just think about the hygienic conditions of the time, right? And these societies were much tidier than we think, but still in measures that we would find incapable, right? With today's sanitary standards, legitimately, it was a life that surely was healthier in other ways, but especially in the cities were very crowded places, and that's why also the system was shocked from the same logistical centers, because medieval cities were consistently more crowded than, for example, the Roman ones. There were big systems, there were states within states, if you want, and they were really the center of this major medieval civilization that had developed from the previous 4 centuries, had gravitated around, right? And and the poor tendentially went to the city, right? That was the place where they could get leftovers, where they could participate to this. But actually, their life was often even more miserable in this situation, and especially now. All these masses of salaried workers that were called just to, not to starve to death, and now living in appalling conditions and being hit the hardest, especially in this regard. In 1399, there was the devotion of the so-called whites for the color of the clothes that they wore. They were essentially flagellants, right, that crossed the whole peninsula. There was even the intensification of the cults of the Passion of Christ because of the attraction exercised by the religious subjects that were dealing with the theme of pain, right? The idea that the sufferings, of course, the earthly sufferings in a Christian mindset is making you closer to Christ's passion. And also the cult of particular saints intensified, such as Sebastian and Rocco, that were believed to be the protectors against the plague, right? Saint Sebastian, as you know, hit by several arrows. So literally they thought at the time that the plague arrived like an arrow from the sky and hit you with all the various, plagues, in fact. And the individual and collective reactions were different at the time. There was definitely an increase of those who disposed in their testaments of donations to the church and in favor of the sickly, right, of the poor and of the children. But there was also who actually bridled himself in during the flaring up of the epidemics. Chronicles talk, for example, about revelries of drunkards in Rome, feasts and banquets in Paris, and even games and tournaments in England. And once again, you can imagine in this hymn to life, to sensuality, etc., how many dead, right? Even sexually speaking, was this idea, let's consume everything before even let's break this this social boundaries also that existed at the time, because it's over, right? And this reveals to you also the relative, lack of faith after all in the afterlife in this regard. I mean, at least in the measure in which life was seen still as a valid gift that had somewhat to be lived at the fullest, and that this idea of sin also was being reconsidered in a certain fashion. Consider that in parallel to this, there is a crisis of the major universal powers, right? The papacy and the empire at this point are sinking, and they will never recover actually as major universal powers. They will never recover the power that they had in the previous centuries, while national monarchies rise, and therefore there are these different polities, these different centers. Huizinga said that at the time, people lived much more intensely their emotions, right? Life and death were celebrated with a much greater passion and charge and commitment that we do today, right? And these people were very interesting as far as we understand, because they could cope with this, the brutality of this world. I mean, think about even just child mortality, or even birth mortality, right? Labor, lots of women dying extremely young, because of the delivery, and this world in which you had seen death consistently more than we do today on average. And today we tend to to put that aside, to say, okay, oh well, that's we know that happens, but we don't want to see it. We want to keep it away. We want to focus on just the enjoyment of the life and celebrating it. People at the time were, if you want, much more real. In this sense, they saw all of this as the part of a great existential trail that had to continue on naturally also in the afterlife. And there was this frequent exposure to the horror, to the violence, to sufferance, even to poverty, right? And two things that we have largely forgotten at this point in history. And that make us think, okay, well, I'm fine as long as it doesn't happen to me. People at the time were probably more concrete under this point of view. They felt more the weight, even of the moral commitment and obligation that derived from this reality, because they were called more directly to take action because of it, right? So there is naturally in the medieval mind this, I don't know what to call it, this craziness, like this character of emotion and even of passion, of happy insanity that was celebrated in these occasions, in these festivals, in this celebration of even material wealth. I mean, the idea that in the Christian world that has never been quite celebrated. In Islam, for example, it's different. In Islam, there is the idea that, if you get wealthy, and you shouldn't abuse what you have, but it's fine because God said, that's a positive thing. Christianity had stressed, the idea that we should imitate Christ even in this poverty that is naturally metaphorical, but that looks at possessions in a kind of a negative fashion in general, in terms of this, surplus that is seen as a devilish production, if you want. So at the time, this society is so a very deep imbalance between this moral standard and what had occurred up to that point. That is, for example, banking, financial activities to being spiked up to a few time before. So there were people who were overwhelmingly rich, and people who were dramatically poor, and this seemed as as a necessarily negative thing in a way or another. So there was evil, there was envy, there was a moral disorientation. I think this century has made much, as I was saying before, for bringing to a secularization of thought proper, and also a stimulus to rationality, because things had gone fairly well in the previous centuries by certain standards, and there was a confidence, like a purity, if you want, even an hypocrisy behind the way, at least official culture had, the one of the establishment had portrayed this. But in there now, there was another moral paradigm that had to be built, right? The idea that also, at this point there is a sort of proto-Protestantism that is spreading because of this evident decline of the papacy, its open political military involvement, this enormous wealth that was paraded. So even certain communities started thinking more thoroughly about the meaning of the scriptures, after all, and how this could be reconciliated with the reality that had in front of their eyes. And the answers could be bad, right? We sometimes look at these worlds and think that the victim and the carnifex are somewhat always the poor person, the good person, and the evil person, and the the cruel person, the bad person. But it's not always like that. But even in here, the evil took over, because this society was still thinking itself in a fundamentally limited way, sectary way. The acknowledgement, for example, of a European conscience was very loose, right? That there was a great localism that was also related naturally to a religious identity that was the overwhelmingly most important one, right? That was truly felt as a sense of nation almost. And the procession of the flagellants, for example, that crossed Europe, increased the excitement against those who were believed to be accomplices of the devil, right, in the work of destabilization of Christianity. And it is exactly in this context that rose once again, especially from the times of the Crusades, but other events had definitely already occurred in between, these ferocious purges, right, of the non-Christians that were deemed to be responsible for the contagions. The Jews were accused of poisoning the wells and to kill the cattle, right, and they became object of persecution in violent persecutions in France, in Flanders, in Hungary, in Catalonia, and especially, above all, in the German area, right, where have been identified 96 distinct pogroms between 1348 and 1350. This is also, unfortunately, and we know it, a spread by social behavior, like the idea of becoming paranoid in front of the crisis and needing to vent your frustration, your sufferance, your denial, right, in front of the present by accusing someone of being responsible for all of this. And definitely we know this long, bloody trail of anti-Judaism that was, revived violently all over Europe at this point, especially in certain specific countries. And there are very interesting subjects about this, which actually show something very disturbing in some way. That is that the majority of people, I mean, of course, as you know, the Jews were discriminated against by standard, but it was still the idea that the Jews were particular compared to the other all non-Christians, because they were naturally considered the closest to Christians existing religiously, but they were also intended to be the ultimate witness of the come of Christ in the last of days, right? So there were actually laws in favor of the protection of the Jews, right? Jews were discriminated, but legally not persecuted, in the sense, especially the church, in front of especially of these scattered communities in Europe, was very, very protected towards the Jews. And what we see is that also the rest of the population, in spite of all the prejudices and the active discrimination, actually didn't care much. I mean, they weren't adverse towards the Jews that in many areas of Europe, by the way, made up historical communities, right? And that also were sometimes increased, and this partly brought, unfortunately, to the same persecution eventually in certain cases, because from certain areas they had been expelled, right? So even this fact that not only they were Jews, but the fact that they came from another country, and therefore they were even seen as, xenophobic prejudices and so on. But the average people was not essentially accusing the Jewry of this. It was rather the elites, right? And this is very disturbing, because you can see in part that even this persecution, these massacres, were led because they wanted to get the money of the richest Jews, right? They didn't need to massacre all the others, but in order to do this, the elite had to mount up the anger and the hatred towards the same Jews, and this led to widespread massacres instead, right? And this is particularly well documented in certain studies of German era. But for example, for what the papacy was concerned, nobody had to touch the Jews for any reason, right? And it was a very astonishing job, actually, that the church did in that case, albeit still discriminating, of course, in protecting actively these people. And one of the simple reasons is that the church, after all, was a super elite in the sense, was technically still namely a universal power, and those who are at the top naturally want their communities to be peaceful. Like having places where you have an entire community massacred, its goods confiscated, is a big deal. Not just because these people are your subjects, they pay taxes very importantly, but also because the rest of society is also tied to it. So definitely, it's not that these people necessarily cared about the well-being of the Jews or not. Maybe they were anti-Semitic as much as the others, but at least in civical terms, they realized that killing these people was seriously bad, because it also disrupted the social order. And it's interesting to study these events in looking at the relation between, in fact, the sovereign powers and the local ones. And also the fear of death in these times assumed new traits, right? Especially for the dramatic presence in everyday life and for the painful experiences that obliged to behave differently, to live differently compared to a recent past. It's something we're living in also today, right? And at the time especially, this left a great mark, even in art, in figurative art especially. A different sensibility probably brought to a transformation that from 14th century onwards began to invest sacred art, for example, developing the theme of death, right, represented now in the form of a skeleton or in a rotten corpse. And the most ancient monumental witness is the one of the fresco in the graveyard of Pisa that was painted by Bonamico Buffalmacco between 1336 and 1338, which is before the plague. And this is interesting because it shows you that there had been actually other smaller epidemics, right? So this sense of insecurity and the triumph of death that is represented in the same work of art is being perceived already before the pandemics. And in this work, in this fresco, you can see that there are some young men on horseback that go look essentially at certain decomposing corpses that were aligned in open coffins in front of them. And it's very heavy to watch in the sense that you really perceive here that there is this morbid fascination even with the concept of death, and this contrast between life in its most beautiful form, like this young men on horseback, well dressed, so people were affluent, who have a wealthy life, right, a lucky life also for those time standards, looking at these dead people and really looking at them on purpose, and that expresses like even the curiosity and the astonishment of a civilization in front of this mass death, right? And then definitely there are also many other famous, definitely more famous works, such as the one painted in the Cemetery of the Innocents in Paris in 1424, that represents the Danse Macabre, through 30 couples of characters of all social conditions that dance together with their own corpse. And this picture, this image, had a terrific success. It was imitated in the rest of France, and from there also in England and in Germany. And the meaning is evident, right? The idea that, first of all, death is within society as a whole, right? Here there is no social distinction. All people die, and the fact of dancing with your own corpse is essentially this eternal fear that you have in front of the reality you're living, that you're going to be next, because you have seen it so often and so directly, right, and so openly, right? What I would like to stress in here, as I was saying before, that death was not concealed at the time, was not masked, was not, you know, exorcised. I mean, you could find in the streets, even not even during the epidemics, but I don't know, corpses on the street in the sense, before being carried away. Everything was very public. You can see it in still in many countries in the world, especially those were still, less developed. I mean, the idea of death is even more natural, is more, is still felt as less disturbing in some way. Probably because there is less to fear from it, because maybe you have less, because maybe you have a worse life, and therefore you don't see that as this huge deal, when instead you consider, I don't know, what certain Western standards, when you can live up to 80 years old with a fairly good level, quality of life, and you look at tragedies like accidents or incurable diseases and things like this, and you say, damn, that this is a huge tragedy. In a world like that, the fact that this concept is present really tells you how the opulence of that society had reached from previous times. Because for this artistic representation to appear explicitated, well, there had to be that realization. But in other poor areas of the world, it was not like so. It's not that that was seen in positive terms. There is always, even if you look at prehistorical societies, there is in the myths, the legends, there is still this idea that death is not like an embellished thing. Even the world of the dead is not an equivalent to the world of the living, simply in a different dimension. I mean, there is in the living nature something positive that you want to enjoy, right? And the success of this picture of the Danse Macabre of Paris in the broader European culture, and beyond the Middle Ages, right? These allegories were very famous. Also, think about Albrecht Dürer, and that is associated. We also made a video about this thing, about the idea of rotting, for example, was very important at the time, because there was of course, the realization that not just the body rots, but also the soul can rot. Right, and while we all have to die, if the soul lives on, right, and if it's been rot, it's been damaged, well, that's something you will have to pay for eternity. And so this invests so many levels of. Think about even the flagellants for a second. We didn't concentrate too much on them. As you know, as we've seen, these were these religious movements that had as mean of penance and mortification the flagellation, right? The self-flagellation, that is, you whip yourself with a certain specific tools, not just, sometimes there were even types of bells, right, for causing horrendous wounds. By the way, there were people who killed themselves, right? This could be achieved through fasting. I mean, through other practices that were borderline also with the connected with this mystic experiences, because if you stop eating, you do have hallucinations, and you think those are visions, divinely inspired, and things like these. But they were fairly widespread in medieval times, not just because of Black Death, right? But they were definitely tendentially associated with this apocalyptic waitings, right? And in Italy, for example, the flagellants were constituted, as we've seen, in brotherhoods, while in Northern Europe, where the phenomenon was actually much more consistent, right? In occasion, at least, of a Black Death, the public flagellation was even banished by the authorities, because it had become really a major problem. Because think about people whipping themselves, and what if, as it often happened at the time, you get infected, and you don't have way to cope with that. Those are people who are going to die further. We're going to be in the healing places, right? And that's going to be even worse, right? And in Northern Europe, it even spread at that point, given that it was forbidden, in the form of small heretical groups, right? which also witnesses the, you know, the common sense of the church that says, what the freak are you doing, right? You know, are you crazy? These people were believing naturally to imitate Christ in its sufferings and getting closer to and all this stuff. Yeah, but I mean, civilly speaking, and that's why, in fact, the secular clergy had, I deem it, as you know, in our history of Christianity, you know, secular clergy did overall a good job in these times and beyond, because they had a more civilly oriented mind, and it is, okay, you want to come closer to Christ's experience, but why the hell do you have to kill yourself? Are you stupid or what? You're going to suffer anyway as a human being. That's what essentially the Bible teaches. So, you know, just be grateful for not suffering, or even if you're inflicting that yourself, just think there's something seriously wrong. And these practices, by the way, were often, in fact, associated with kind of a heterodox thinking, right? And then think about the Cathars, the Bogomils, this already had this contempt towards the material, the flesh, because they considered humanity, the souls of mankind, in this Neoplatonic view, to be trapped within flesh. They didn't even recognize the cross, you know, on which Christ was crucified, because it was made of matter, because matter was created by evil. I mean, all these things that, like, then you wonder why they were persecuted and they were wiped out. Because if you look at this, these were extremistic fringes, even of violent people, because they were actively even, you know, persecuting others and fighting against wealth as such. And I think in a proto-capitalistic mindset, that is the one that effectively created the Renaissance, created an improvement in our civilization. You look at these people and say, what the hell do you want? And we still have, I mean, these forms of people in our own society, right? That it's normal that extremistic fringes have this role, and maybe that shakes the conscience, which is better than living in a society with a single thought, and it challenges the idea, but sometimes it also creates problems, and that's when you're going to stop certain things. Because not even today you can harm yourself. You know, people intervene to stop you. But aside from this, just think at how, you know, everything is not just a cultural expression. It's really a human thing. It's a biological thing, right? Humans tend to behave in similar ways, even socially speaking, right? We know that more or less societies have a similar dynamic after all. So the plague, in particular, left dramatic echoes also in literature. Famously, at the time, the as we were saying before, the majority of the chronicles addressed expressly the topic by imputing to the sins of mankind the cause of the plague as such. Wars, homicides, the behavior of bad Christians, etc. And the origin of the contagion was clearly seen in the East, right? This world that was represented as magic and terrible at the same time, populated by the heathens that cared only about the death of the Christians, while actually, just for example, the Islamic world was being hit hard by the plague itself. And this was also a way to... this is fascinating because it still makes you realize now that separation that had occurred after the fall of Acre between, you know, in a geographical awareness, the fact that from one side there were the Eatons that were not even fully understood to be Muslims, telling you the truth at the time. Think about Dante, you know, one of the peaks of of Western civilization, and then one of the greatest, possibly the greatest author of the Middle Ages, that believed that Muhammad was a schismatic bishop, right, of a Christian, and but the idea that the Christianity was from one side, and this thing from the other, right, and the fact that this reflects also a general reflection over the role of even of these peoples in the creation, and that render the plague also of a greater importance than an event that happens to just one person or one community, but has to do with the Christian world as a whole that is threatened and that is paying, that has lost the Holy Land because it's evil, right? And God is punishing it because they have failed and they're bad. Christians fight against each other, and all this stuff, right? And the literature, as we were saying, emphasized especially the sense of anxiety and the awareness that the beauty of youth and the pomp and splendor of the powerful were under the constant threat of death. This was also an important realization that this was a great leveler, right? And think that this 14th century world had been shaken by important events that we also discussed in our military historical videos about. Think about the Battle of Courtrai that had broken this primacy of the feudal elite on the battlefield. Even the noblemen had been massacred by the people, by the commoners, right? And which was inconceivable. This was a world gone upside down, right? Of course, noblemen could kill each other every once in a while. They preferred to take each other as prisoners. The people here is this brute force that emerges from the bottom of society and that goes on the battlefield just to kill. Like, it literally doesn't give a damn about catching you prisoner. It's going to just massacre you. And now even this divine punishment that kills everybody, that kills the Christianity as a whole, that gives itself, as we were saying before now, a greater consciousness, even in a spatial and time dimension. Probably the greatest example in European literature is the Decameron of the Florentine Giovanni Boccaccio, that with its young protagonists that took refuge in a country villa, reflects the use actually of the rich people to isolate from the contagion, right, outside Florence in that case, and also describes superbly the sinister sense of threat that incumbent on the society of the time. And these are young women and young men that go out there in the countryside and they live gaily in the reading and having fun, telling these stories that make up the Decameron itself. And that are very vivacious stories. I mean, they're very vivid, lively, and colorful stories that come out in civilization, in this fantastic work, because of the threat of death, right? And it doesn't seem that our quarantine now has produced particular, artistic and cultural achievements in this regard. But it makes you realize how at the time life was trying to find a way through anyway, as we were saying at the beginning. There is another phenomenon that is partly associated to the plague that is relatively a latter, but I think it's interesting anyway. That is witch hunting. So in 1348, in some areas of England, some women that lived alone, practicing healing, right, were accused of witchery and essentially massacred by the crowd that was searching for scapegoats because of the plague. Such episodes gave start to a multi-secular phenomenon that is known in fact as witch hunting, that had as object particularly women that at the time were believed to be responsible for original sin, and that they were for this reason potentially in contact, more easily in contact with the demon. Now, what is interesting, aside from the dramatic thing in itself, is that these beliefs now were associated, however, to a very interesting anthropological character existing in the society of the time. That was the permanence in what was formerly Christian Europe, still of this robust amount of beliefs and practices that had essentially pagan origin, and that were associated to another system of belief in parallel. Now, this happened at all levels of society. I mean, if you were, for example, kings, cities, all the greatest authorities out there that were fully Christian, formally, had all teams of astrologers on their own, right? And you'd say, how is it possible? Well, because the idea at the time was that, first of all, of course, the stars and the skies were a part of the creation, and therefore studying them could be, it wasn't even a duty to understand the great symbol that God had created in order to be deciphered by mankind, right? And this idea naturally boosted things like scholastics, right? And this studies, and astronomy being, as you know, a military science, and was blurred with astrology at this point. It was all once. There was no distinction, just with alchemy, right? This idea that the universe was fundamentally populated by, certain forces that you could somewhat channel, and they were partially connected also with evil, and that therefore arose, moral perplexities and so on. This women living alone and having such practices and even capacities, because there were sometimes some of the best healers at the time, considered that medicine was something very theoretical at this point. It would remain for most of the modern age. Sometimes barbers and women who attended childbirth and helped the delivery were much more competent than doctors in such matters. It was in parallel to this. There were parallel beliefs of some sort of rituals and other practices that naturally were seen by the rest of the community, could be seen by the rest of the community in part as non-orthodox, right? And these, as in for others like non-Christians, etc., we're used as scapegoats, or like saying this person has made a pact with the devil, has done something that here I don't understand. And the thing is that these people, women and sometimes men alike, actually, truly believed in a parallel system of, an exoteric, occult system that was openly known by themselves to be somewhat incompatible with a Christian teaching, and that kept it hidden exactly for this reason. It's difficult to draw a line because such beliefs were so widespread by a certain standard that, there was not the survival as neo-pagans may think that, I don't know, up to this point there are people who have continued to believe in the same, this systems of pre-Christian times that were hidden, concealed, and forced down, destroyed by Christianity, and now are re-emerging exactly how they were at the time. No, they were simply superstitions, things that had evolved even from the recent centuries. That people naturally believed at the time, just that they could believe today. Like, it's like winning to the lottery. It doesn't have, it's not very distant as a concept. This idea of superstition, of doing something that will bring you good luck or bad luck, it were essentially found in the same thing about the tarots, all this symbology, this exoterism. There is actually, it is true that sometimes there was a culture behind it. There was an important cultural legacy, but at the same time it had somewhat always coexisted with Christianity that cared up to a certain point, and it just at this point began to essentially, in parallel with the tightening of political and social control, and the increase of this, even religious tensions, or still for political reasons, often began to target these people pretty viciously. And even if though this was intensified it started somewhat from the mid 14th century. Something, of course, had always existed, but it was minor compared, in fact, to what would happen in modern age. Like witch hunting is something that pertains mostly to Protestant countries in the modern age. Right, by the end of the 16th century, the Roman Church laughed at the idea of burning a woman because she could practice sorcery, things like these. It was completely outside. But in certain other parts of Europe, and even the New World, where these had expanded, this thing of witch hunting went on for a freaking long time. I mean, North America, as far as I know, even in the early 18th century, I mean, it's crazy. But it happened because in these communities, they were also fairly isolated. Also, it was pretty easy to I mean, life was not easy in this world. You don't have to imagine as to communities and families happily living in the rural world, working, smiling, and happily. It was an incredibly violent, oppressive, and criminal reality where people were regularly abused. Crimes went unpunished. There was an extreme violence. It was a disgusting reality, and we have to be very happy not to live in those times anymore. If anything, for this reason, and you can imagine all the reasons for which someone would like even to burn his own neighbor, right? And accusing, his wife of witchery, and all of these things. And this is really not a great example, let's say, coming from more advanced or enlightened societies, indeed. And these things find parallel pretty much everywhere. Many people believe that these things began with Christianity. Look at what happened in the pagan Roman Empire. It was actually the same. There were certain cults that were witchery, actually, that were forbidden because they were believed to unleash, negative forces that would harm the empire. So there were famously the licit cults and the non-licit cults. So even the idea of the tolerance that allegedly for some, at least, I still believe in this world, was wiped out by the Christians is somewhat pretty debatable. But aside from this, there is also a real social value behind it. In the sense that we don't have neither to see these victims of witch hunting as martyrs of free thinking or rationality or individual courage to stand against the orthodoxy and obscurantism. These people were as obscurantistic, as superstitious, as immoral as their killers could be. Because at the time, people believed the same things, right? And in different forms with different contexts, but essentially they stemmed from a reality that frankly is not even very, whichever you can think. But I mean, I think it's a bit more valuable, for example, to be literate and educated and studying, a complex theological and philosophical system like the one of the monotheism, than believing in evil eye and making sorceries, slitting animal throats and things like these. And it's very symptomatic in this regard that the church was the last one to stop believing in such things. Like the church and the elites were very often in this regard the voice of reason in front of such practices that frankly were representative of belief systems that couldn't even imagine to compete with the Christianity itself. And aside from the beliefs, however, there is to point out another more serious and more valuable point. That is that society has always been very, very evil towards the different, towards the exception, towards the less, the disabled as well. I mean, many people were mentally ill, and or that had even certain other types of illnesses that made them different and made them were seen at the time, in the ignorance, of course, of the time, as monsters, as someone who had that God had forsaken, that they were not humans and things like that, and they were killed for this reason. And this is a tendency that, again, increases also during the modern age, actually. There's also this confinement of these people. So actually the Middle Ages was much more open than we imagine in this regard. And such... And the medieval man was much more curious of the exception, to frame it in the world, rather than what secularization eventually brought aside to eliminate coldly, cynically, right? And witchery naturally was also in here to be considered, in which terms, because it was broadly seen as this exercise of magical powers attributed to individuals who were deemed capable to enter in contact with supernatural beings, right? And as we were saying before, this idea had always been fought by the Christian Church, that was mostly concerned about the fact of really the challenge that such superstitions could have towards the sacerdotal role of mediation with the sphere of the holy, right? It was not really a desire to flatten other beliefs as such, but if these were touching the natural mediation that, according to the Church, that had to exist between naturally the faithful and the sphere of the sacred, well, this was a serious problem, and it had to be naturally taken care of, right? You consider at this time that such beliefs were also largely connected with, even with illiteracy, with forms that we somewhat, I realize there is, we should open a huge parenthesis, but it's not the case now. But just for saying that there is this belief that the society, the civilization, which is a culturalist idea, which is actually pretty bad, and it has as only a direct consequence discrimination, if not even racism in certain cases. The idea that our civilization is inherently aggressive and evil, and wicked, and that we have done nothing good, and we have erased all what existed before because it was better, and the evil has prevailed over it. And when you look at what this comparison is done with, and you look at what this pre-Christian beliefs were about, and you compare it with our systems of learning today, with the thing that Christian pioneered in terms of a massive intellectual development of philosophical inquiry, of scientific inquiry, because yes, there was nothing more scientifically advanced in the Middle Ages than what the Church pioneered. Also because they were the only people who studied, so that was literally also compared to the previous world, of course. Don't think the Middle Ages was inferior to the ancient world in terms of scientific inquiry. That's wrong. They were the same level, right? They were the same level. There were minor improvements in the Middle Ages in optics, for example, that speak even for some, if I'm improvement indeed, but they were definitely not inferior. Then you compare to these beliefs and you say, yeah, like, once again, slitting an animal's throat, doing some, mixtures with, herbs and stuff, that surely could work sometimes, right? Because traditional remedies were fundamentally about that. But that called into work this primitive forces of nature associated to other rites, etc. Do you think that was an actual developed knowledge that we have erased to supplant it with monotheism that was something so, inferior and, primitive and barbarian? Seriously, this is the question of it, right? Look at what the Church, even just by spreading literacy. Look, many people are freak out with things for the one of the most greatest misunderstandings in historical reality that derives actually from Protestant historiography, black legions over Catholic countries historically during the modern age, exactly where they were still burning witches, by the way. is that the Inquisition, for example, was now the worst thing. Like what was like Nazi Germany replicated in the Middle Ages. Inquisition was actually the single fairest tribunal for those time standards, where all your rights were respected according to the law of the time, where the proof had to be brought forward. You couldn't condemn people without proof, which in secular tribunals happened all the time. It killed an astonishing few amount of people compared to secular tribunals. Once again, it spread literacy. It was supported by the average people. It spread awareness about their own religion in times in which it had been received largely passively. The church in general took care of the homeless, of the poor, of the abandoned children, of rejected individuals from society, women who in fact had, they allowed them the possibility, for example, of donating their children, right, for them adoptive therapy. I mean, there is an astonishing amount of positivity, right? Whereas if you look at this rural reality, of course, these other systems were fitting with the lifestyle of the time, especially people living according still to the agricultural cycles, with this more direct contact with nature. They saw still the world in a different way, but it wasn't like more intellectually developed, more civilly, accomplishing than what this other dimension was actually building at the levels of elites, at the levels of those who ruled the world at the time, that made it possible for the world, after all, to improve. Right? So I would like to make you understanding here that the two dimensions. That is not to say, these pagan cults were wrong, but they didn't bring even. There is no comparison, quantitatively speaking, in terms of the sheer amount of improvement that they brought in human civilization at that point in history. Without mentioning that these cults, I mean, were something you could find, you still can find, in certain areas. In Europe, I don't think personally that neo-paganism is by any stretch of the imagination a direct continuation of ancient pagan cults. It's actually an insult, in my opinion, to those cults. It's often not even based on historical awareness about these realities. But, hey, whatever, floats your boat. But the point is, when we talk about history, let's be honest about the historical reality that we know from sources. And no, you can't say, the history is written by those people who have erased the truth. No, because there is no evidence in the sheer immense amount of evidence that exists. There's not been, by any stretch of the imagination, again, filtered entirely by Christianity in this world, and we have plenty of other cultures, including pagan ones, that survive in this regard, that those realities, had preserved who knows which kind of hidden wisdom, and no, they were simply the expression of rural societies that were usually underdeveloped compared to centers of civilization at the time. That still worked on the base of the agricultural world, but that we know was busy working, right? It was not producing who knows which other alternative or parallel system of civilization, right? Also because civilization emerged exactly from that world, and it didn't kept following that trail, because evidently when you rise above a certain level, you build way more complex and sophisticated systems that are the ones that have helped us improving, right? Scientific achievements have not happened in the rural, half Christianized countryside. They have developed in the most, in the most far environments from that one. So, but this is the polemical note over these things. But let's say that since the mid-14th century, it was developed at least the idea that witchery was a sort of hostile sect. This is true. This is what brought to the paranoia and to the criminal mindset. Right? It was found that on the pact with the devil, and his dominant, its culminating cult was this periodical summoning of the Sabbath, right? So the Sabbath was this periodical summoning, ideally, of witches and wizards, to which the belief reached the most elaborated form around, in fact, the mid 14th century, and especially in the Western Alpine regions, right? There are certain specific communities in Europe where this also spread, and according to this belief that interpreted the practices of witchery as a sort of contestation of dogmas and the sacraments of the church, the summoning of the Sabbath were held by night in isolated places where the witches came, flying in over, animals, and they, rendered homage to the devil that was present in the form of an animal, right? So this was all in fact, a demonization of ancient pagan beliefs that still had at the center, naturally, this of reality, this natural world connected to this, primitive, this natural forces of the world, of the elements, right? So the initiated, according to them, were to reject Christian faith and to profane the sacraments. These were also the typical accusations of witch hunting. The Sabbath eventually, according to the witch hunters, culminated in banquets, dances, and sexual orgies, and in the consignment to the witches of certain malefic unguents that were thought to be used eventually by the plague spreaders. That was the belief, right? That these people were plotting against Christian society and destroying it by, killing eating their children and doing things like these. And you realize in here that the level of paranoia that assumes in certain moments a character of definitely of insanity, and that is directed at targeting certain isolated elements of society that were believed to live exactly at the outskirts of this other kind of more enlightened view. So the very dramatic story of witch hunting is that very often the people who were accused couldn't have justice, right? That because the societies themselves, small societies usually, that were bigoted, prejudiced, and evil in their the pretty miserable moral standards, looked at this way of taking out those who were different from them, and even seizing their miserable, taking them away, even normalizing a situation. Think about all these, even emarginated people who lived. You can imagine. Even in the wild, still at this time, in the mid 14th century, with the demographic contraction, many lands came back to be covered in swamps and forests, and there were people who lived out there, and that were sent. What the hell are they? Like, they didn't attend, for example, the mass, who were outside still. It was typical of certain areas of Central Europe, especially, where there were properly forest communities that were cut out from the major urban centers, for example. So this was a way to normalize a space as well, in the most violent form, and also, correcting certain behaviors that objectively existed at the time, right? This fact of the Sabbath that contemplated the gathering in secret places, they did happen, right? It was not invented completely. There were still such beliefs that particular areas that with a pagan past had a special magic value, right? We know that there were many, also fortunately less violent means to try to eradicate these cults that even didn't succeed, right? We know from many communities still in the 19th century, these things were alive and eventually were lost. Well, what wasn't achieved by white Christianity was achieved by secularization, modernization, right? Where people forgot their origins, forgot these beliefs that, as we were saying before, were actually much more common than we think. Just the problem is that when this matched with a kind of a distancing from the regular Christian life that was bad, right? And where instead these people maybe kept believing them, but they still were positive about Christianity, or at least were not particularly socially alienated, to be accused of being different in that regard, they even coexist, right? In fact, as we were saying before, the line was pretty blurry. The same goes for astrologers. Astrologers were as we were saying, were interviewed, like they were inquired by the local authorities regarding what would happen, because really people at this time believed that even the epidemics, earthquakes, floods happened because of how the stars were aligned. And the only problems with Christianity arose in that regard when there were some astrologers that began to actually refute Christianity, to say, this thing, the our powers were superior to the ones of God, starting even, propagating these ideas, and that's where they were put down. But otherwise, this astrologer simply said, this is all fitting with our Christian beliefs. They don't contradict any. But if we want to know theoretically what will happen in the future, looking at stars, here it is, right? And you can't give or take it, because it's still God's will. So it's actually a topic that would deserve much more attention than this video. Maybe we'll talk about it on another occasion. And as always, these videos become to be too polemical, especially at the beginning when you start questioning so many different aspects of our society that is almost disturbing. And I'm not sure you're interested in listening to this. But anyhow, I think there are important questions that must be, stressed also in comparison with our day, right? Because we are living objectively in a dramatic time that doesn't leave us many happiness. We see the sufferings, we see the problems, of those who lost it. They're the ones who can't go on, economically speaking, and all of this may, I hope not so, but this great problem, this great emotional reaction may definitely not take over, but at least create pretty serious problems to our world. And we have to be aware that it's a possibility. If you look at that past, it happened. It was a much less rational, secular, and modern world than our own. But don't think that the unbalances that can happen today, because even of an imitation of similar behavior of such attitudes, can have disastrous consequences in our systems, right? So aside from this, I think we stop here. And for now, just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.